Today's topic is we're talking specifically about the differences between field and studio production. You know, the similarities, the differences, in which situations you might choose one over the other, and things that you need to keep in mind. So basically there is two different types of productions. There's time-sensitive productions, and then there's timeless productions. So your time-sensitive productions are going to be when you're promoting an upcoming event or the event itself that you want to film. Those are all time-sensitive. Everything else falls into, with a few exceptions, falls into the category of timeless. It's information that doesn't have an expiration date, and in that sense, it does provide you a little bit more flexibility in how long it takes you to produce the program, because you don't have that deadline except one that you might place upon yourself for it. So when you're producing, you have a choice of using field, studio, or a mix of both. And field productions are much like the setup that our intern Sam is using. It's a camera that you can take with you anywhere and use anywhere on the go. And then the studio setup is a specialized location, you know, you know, it's a specialized location that's set up specifically to do productions, and you go to it. Pretty much if you're filming an event, that's always going to be a field setup. Again, with a few exceptions, it will always be a field setup, because you can't take the studio to most events and you can't bring most events to the studio. So you're going to use a field camera. Everything else in terms of promoting events and all of the timeless programs can be a mix of studio, field, you know, either or, studio, field, or a mix of both. And when you make that choice, there's going to be a couple of determining factors. One is going to be timing, because, you know, if you want to use the studio, is the studio available when you and the group of people that are planning to use it, are you all available at the same time? Does that schedule even work? You know, with enough prior proper planning, yes, usually something can work out, but not always, in which case sometimes the field production setup becomes the better option just for timing alone, because you can take it out, but then you have more wiggle room to work out various schedules. You can film a couple people one day and maybe other people another day, or it just means that you can have it with you for when you can all get together, which may be at a time that the studio is not available. Another factor is going to be the type of project. You know, so you were talking about the project at the transfer station, okay? You could absolutely have a conversation about recycling in the studio alone, all right, and not be out in the field, have a sit-down roundtable discussion, and lay out all the pertinent information. And you could even, maybe somebody took some photos or something that you want to drop in later, but you could have it be a total studio shoot, and that's fine. You could also have it be a field shoot on its own, and that's fine too. Some people might want the ability to do things in the studio where there's a controlled environment for the discussion portion of things, but then they're going to take a field camera out to get what we call B-roll, which is just supporting footage that's going to get dropped in later that helps illustrate what is being discussed. And so that's how you would use a mix of the two. So then it just comes down to, again, environment, and we're going to actually talk a bit about that later on, but sometimes it really just comes down to, you know, we've had groups that could do a studio shoot, but they felt that they just wanted to do it outside because it was a little less formal and a little more relaxed, and there was no other reason to make that choice. It was just environment, you know, a change in pace, and that's another important factor to make. And then finally, how much editing do you want to do? All right, in the talk about mixing studio and field, it can add a really nice touch and allow you to bring in a lot more detail and depth to a program, but it can also require some more editing after the fact or in post-production. And again, if you are not inclined to do that for any reason, including maybe you just don't have the time in terms of how the scheduling comes together, then it may not be the right choice to do a mix. and you want to pick one or the other, and work through your production process to make it as seamless as possible so you don't have to do editing or very little of it. But those are some things to keep in mind. When you're talking about the technology involved in studio and field production, there are similarities in both. Studio and field both have a video component in that they're using at least one video camera, and they have an audio component because you need to capture sound, particularly if you're doing an interview situation. And in both you need to be mindful of lighting. Certainly more lighting yields better video, regardless of what you're using, whether you're in the studio, out in the field, using a semi-professional camera like this, or even using a mobile device, a cell phone. Lighting is an important factor to get clear, crisp video. That's kind of where the similarities end, though, where they start to differ. Studio setups are a controlled environment. First of all, a lot of them are built to be soundproof, so you don't have to worry about all sorts of ambient noise getting in the way and being picked up. They are set up and wired for multiple microphones, so if you have a big group that you need to mic for any reason, and for a lot of different reasons too. I mean, predominantly we have talk format programs coming into the studio, but we've also had some acting groups in, people that have done solo music and things like that, and so they require a little bit of a different audio setup than your typical roundtable discussion, which is pretty easy to replicate out in the field in addition to the studio. But the studio just lends itself to that kind of variety. It lends itself better to the kind of lighting that is ideal for video. Everything from the large 500-watt studio lamps to being able to block out other ambient light coming from windows and things like that. It lends itself to that. Much better. It's also wired to take multiple cameras and to be able to switch between them. Anywhere from 2 to 4 or more cameras can be set up in a studio, but then you have a whole control room in the back that lets you choose those shots on the fly. Whereas when you're doing field programming like this, the camera operator, you don't usually have that ability. You have to either plan it so that way you're cutting the shot before you set up your next shot, or you have to have a camera person who's really adept at being able to zoom in and out and pan and tilt smoothly, so that way you don't have to cut anything out when there's a transition from one speaker to another or one scene to another. So studio is a much more controlled environment, but also to make it run really well, it's helpful if you have more than one crew member. So it also can involve more people to really make it work. Now, that's not to say that you can't do it with one person. We do it all the time because there's the ideal setup of having, 2 or 3 camera people, a sound person, and a director. And then there's the reality that usually if you get a director and maybe one other person to help somewhere, it still can all come together in the studio, look wonderful, and the show goes on, okay? With the field is much less controlled. Often in the typical situation for public access anyway, you don't always know what the scenario is, where you're going to be shooting, how many windows are around, what's the lighting situation, how much ambient noise is going to be occurring, or you might have a room to yourself, but is there a lot of activity going on, in the surrounding rooms that are going to kind of filter in? Do you have a lot of windows but low light here? Because these are all different temperatured lights between, the indoor fluorescents are one, and the light is coming from the outside is a whole other, and that could really kind of mess a little bit with how your overall picture looks, which can be fixed in editing, but again, more easily controlled in a studio setting when you're white balancing for one type of light versus multiple. Okay? You can account for a certain number of microphones, usually 2, more if you have a bigger field setup, okay? It is possible to replicate a studio situation out in the field, all right? But again, typically for public access, it's not reasonable. Most people aren't going to want to deal with setting up all that equipment, because in a studio situation, all the stuff is already set up. You're turning it on and changing certain settings, but for the most part, it's all set up. Nobody ever has to deal with plugging in wires and setting up tripods or anything like that. In the field, you're setting it all up. So most of the time, when out in the field, people are looking for a simple setup, okay? So, and we talk to a lot of people who come in for training, or even people who know how to set up the equipment, but are filming different things. We often have a conversation about the logistics and what kind of a program are you filming in the field? Do you know where you're going to be filming? Here are the things to look for, and here's how you want to go about planning it out, so that way, again, you don't have to do any or very little editing, okay? Because you are typically only going to use one camera. Some people do and are comfortable with taking out 2 and 3 cameras, because they do plan on doing a lot of editing afterwards. They're very good at the editing. They can mix all the cameras together. So we have that capability for people who want to use it, and there are people who have, but the majority don't. When they're doing a field camera, they want to keep it as simple as possible, make sure that they're getting good video, good audio, and that they're doing it in a way so hopefully they're not going to have to do much editing, okay? But editing is there for anybody that needs it. And sometimes they just need to take out something. Maybe there was a little flub somewhere, and we often recommend, if that's the case, then you try to backtrack and maybe start a segment over, not the whole show, but maybe just a segment, because we don't want to be in a situation where you're trying to cut out in between sentences or even paragraphs. It never looks good, so when possible, we try to talk to people about, well, try to figure out what point you can start over from, and we'll take it from there, and it makes a nice cleaner cut in editing. Sometimes the show itself goes wonderful, and all you want to do is add some titles at the beginning and end, especially if there's a website that you want to include at the end, a list of your speakers and your guests, and that's usually very simple to take care of. And maybe you want to add a little bit of music, or you just need to boost the audio a little bit. Maybe you have a speaker who is a little too quiet, and you just need to boost that audio a little bit. So there's some very simple things that you can do in editing. And then for everything else, editing is also, you can do some really creative stuff. And we have the software and the capability to do it. And we have the people there that can train somebody and walk somebody through that process if they wanted to get really fancy with a lot of different layers of photographs coming in to illustrate something, to do voiceover work and add music, and really do a fancy production. There is that capability there as well, if you have the inclination, and if you allow yourself the time to do that. That's usually not an option for time-sensitive programs, but for some of the timeless programs, especially people doing a series, sometimes they'll put extra effort into doing like an opening montage that's going to be the same. They do it once, but it's going to be the same for each episode of the series, and the only thing that changes is the subtitle of the series that illustrates what the topic is. And people will get very creative for the beginning of the program, and then maybe not do any editing for the main show, or very little. Maybe there's, again, some photos that they need to drop in or something like that. Nothing too crazy, and it gets through pretty quickly. Okay, so once you have a program idea, you kind of know, you kind of know what you want to do in terms of, you have your guest, you have your topic matter, you might even know that you want to do it out in the field or the studio or both. Okay. And maybe you know that there's going to be even a little bit of editing. But either way, once you have a program idea, then you got to take into account the timing of it all, okay? So at GCTV, equipment use is on a first-come, first-served basis. And so if you were to call me the day before or the day of and ask for a camera, if it's available, I will sign it out. But I recommend to people that as soon as an event is in your calendar, then you want to, and you want to either promote it or you have a program idea and you want to be able to film it, you want to get in touch with me at least 2 weeks in advance of when you want the equipment, when you want the field equipment, or when you want the studio set up. Because especially if you're also going to be asking us to contact some of our volunteers to assist as crew, the more advance notice we have to start working with those volunteers and hopefully getting you some crew. Or if you have people that are interested but need to be trained, we need that lead time to get everybody in and train them and ready to rock and roll for the actual date when you're going to be doing the filming. And also, if you think that there's going to be an editing component, you want to allow for some time on a later date shortly thereafter to take care of some of the editing. So once a program is submitted to GCTV, it can take up to a week from the time we receive a completed program until it gets up for its first broadcast on the channel. So again, if you were to drop something off to us on a Monday, that does not mean that it's going to get broadcast for the following Tuesday. It may not go on for a week later. So if you're dealing with time-sensitive content, we often recommend that people get completed programs to us 4 to 6 weeks before the event date that they're trying to promote, because it allows for that 1 week lead time, and then it allows plenty of time for us to air the program multiple times, and if permission is given, also put it up on YouTube, where then the link can be shared and circulated on social media and email and things like that. And so if we need a finished product 4 to 6 weeks before, that means you need to be planning its production well before that. So that way you can get the equipment, training, film, maybe do some editing, okay? But when you're dealing with timeless programming, it's still kind of, the same rule applies. Give us a couple weeks notice if you want to use the camera and the field equipment, just so we can make sure it's available and it's going to assure for you that it's available, and we can work to get you some crew members. And then after that, what your schedule is for editing and putting it up on the channel may not be as crucial at that point, because it's not time sensitive. You have some time to work within to do that. So if you're looking to do something like this, the first step is always to give me a call. Give me a call, email me, and set up an appointment to come talk about your program. All right, if you're not sure where to begin, that's where to begin, because I'll sit down with you and talk about what your plans are for the program, what you're hoping to capture. Again, talking about timing, is it time sensitive or something a little more timeless that you're trying to produce, and who you're trying to reach with it, and help you work through the whole process of planning for it. So depending on how many cameras are in the studio that you're using, at GCTV right now we have 3 active cameras. We can actually set up even, at times we've set up even another field camera or 2 if somebody wanted even more angles that they were going to mix in later, but a typical studio setup is 3 to 4 cameras. And yes, usually what happens is that one of your cameras is always going to be a wide shot of everybody that's on stage. We call it the safety shot. So that way, if for any reason the other cameras have a hard time catching up or getting the single shot of someone talking, the director in the back just stays on the wide shot until things get settled out. And then your other cameras are set up based on what's happening on stage. So one camera is typically on whoever the moderator is, the person that's going to open up the show, introduce the guests, and basically kind of manage the flow of the conversation, asking certain questions of the guests. And then another camera might focus on the guests themselves. If you happen to have somebody that can man the camera, then that person can zero in on a single guest talking and move over to another guest, or zoom out and get a group shot of the guests. If for any reason you don't have camera crew, often what we do is do stagnant shots. Our wide shot, our moderator, and then if there's 2 or 3 guests, then that camera ends up being a group shot of just the guests that we can go to when somebody starts talking. So that's where studio and field is a little bit different, okay? So when you're in the field, as you have been, okay, you have a cameraman who's running the one camera, and their job is to zoom in, zoom out, pan over to the person talking, okay? When you're in the studio with multiple cameras, each camera has a job, all right? And if you have one cameraman, then you're going to put that cameraman on the camera he's going to do the most good on, okay? So if one of the cameras is your wide shot, as one always should be, you don't need a cameraman on that. You set the shot and then you leave it. If the other camera is also on your moderator, you set that shot and you leave it. And then if the other camera is going to be going between your multiple guests, that's where you want your cameraman to be, because they're going to move the camera among the multiple guests when they're talking. In addition, there should be somebody in the back room that's doing all the switching between the cameras on the fly, okay? So at GCTV, a scenario like that, we would need 2 crew members, someone who's going to run the camera, or a camera in any case, and then another person who's going to be the second person who's going to be the director in the back. And they're going to make choose which camera they switch to during the conversation, and also manage the audio and things like that. And your director, a show can always go on with just a director. You can do a show with no camera people, because the director is going to set all the cameras up when all the guests are seated, and they're going to set up the microphones and do a microphone check and make sure that everybody's audio levels are as they should be. And then they're going to hit record, and then based on the flow of the conversation, they're going to choose what camera shots to take and switch to what actually gets recorded. Okay? You can always do a show with just a director and no camera people. Camera people become crucial when you have a lot of guests and you want to be able to have some visual variety in the shots. Because unless your studio is set up with remote controlled cameras that your director can control from the back room, and I don't know too many access stations that have that, or any, quite frankly, unless you've got that situation, technologically speaking, you need to get a couple, 1 or 2 camera people in that can listen to a director give instruction about, okay, camera 1, I need you to go in on this person who's talking. And that's where before you do the shoot, it's good to have a conversation about what is the nature of the studio shoot that you're doing. Are you doing a talk show, and are you going to have a moderator and 1 guest, moderator and 2 guests? In one case we had a moderator and they brought in an entire group of people, in which case we did not even try to give everybody a microphone because we just didn't have enough inputs. But we set them up with a handheld mic. We set them up with a handheld microphone that they could walk around and interview people on the stage in the studio. If that's the situation, okay, then that can be handled a couple different ways depending on who you end up having for crew, okay? So it might be that you're going to have a wide shot, which should hopefully capture everything, and you're going to have if you have just 1 camera person, then that person is going to be on the guest, okay? And when the guest is talking, it's going to be likely your typical shot of chest up for talking, okay? And then at such a time, if there's a demonstration portion of it, all right, hopefully the person who's doing the directing in the back, they're going to probably go to a wide shot. So that way your camera person will have a chance to then zero on what's happening with their feet. All right? So that's one way to handle it, okay? Another way to handle it is that if there's going to be a demonstration portion, is that you have the talk show, and then on the show, in taping, you say, well, This has been very informative. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, our guest is going to give us a demonstration of, and then they're going to cut tape, probably fade to black or something, and cut tape in the back. And then that was going to give you a chance to reposition things in the studio, your guest, yourself, your cameras. And then they're going to count you in, and you're going to probably fade up from black, and you're going to do the demonstration. And then that's it. So a lot of the issues in terms of production and camera shots and angles, studio, field, or otherwise, a lot of it can be handled by planning ahead of time and thinking through what it is that you want to do, and then managing your resources, your technology, the crew that you have involved, and your time. It's really just kind of thinking through all those things. You know, there's usually a couple different ways you could do any type of show, but when you look at all those elements that really drive a production, you're going to make decisions based on that. You might do the same show 3 different ways if other circumstances were different. If you had more people, less people. If done correctly, and the person in the back is able to, you know, fade to black, after you say, and we'll be back after this break with a demo from so-and-so about such and such, okay? Mm-hmm. They're going to cut mics, fade to black, and all of that is done cleanly. Then they're going to fade up from black and cue the talent to do the demo.
Yeah.
That editing is already done. You don't even have to do it after the fact. It's already been taken care of by planning ahead of time that this is what's going to happen and this is what needs to be done. Okay? If it was not done as cleanly, then you would put it into a computer after the fact and clean it up, make the cut, and add the transitions of fading to and from black to make that a little cleaner if you wanted to. The short answer is a lot. There's a lot of different things that you can do depending on what it is you're looking to do. So if you're looking to correct problems, okay, generally with both lighting and sound, it's better to record things with it being a little too dark and audio being a little too soft than to have it where your lighting is way too hot or your sound is way too high. So in the case of sound that is way too loud, and I'm sure you've all experienced this at some point, a television or a radio is up really high and it gets to the point where you're not even hearing the individual words because it creates almost like a staticky sound that's not clear at all, not crisp. If sound is recorded that way in video, it cannot be fixed. You cannot get that detail back. That distortion is there. You can always lower it, but you're just lowering the sound of the distortion. And that's why recording things a little too softly is better, because because the detail's still there most likely, unless you really did too soft and where it was almost non-existent. That's a whole other problem, but to do it just a little too soft is always better, because then you can always raise it and do other things in order to make it the right level. With lighting, it's a similar situation. When things are way too bright or too hot, you start to lose details of shadows that make up an image. It starts to look like it's all one tone, sometimes almost all white, if it's really too bright. And again, you can't get that detail back in editing once you've lost it. You can always make things darker, but once the detail is gone, you're just making that detailless image a little darker. So it's better to err on the side of things being a little too dark, and then doing things in editing to deal with lighting. And also in editing with lighting is you can color correct things. We were talking earlier about, when I was talking about the lighting and how you can have multiple light sources from the indoor lights and then light coming in the windows, and you can't always control that. Mm-hmm. And so it can do some funny things with the color of the video. Sometimes things look a little too blue, sometimes things look a little too orange. you can do something called color balancing and editing, which is to kind of do the white balancing after the fact. If you don't do it before you shoot, which you should always try to do, or if white balancing before you even start shooting still doesn't quite yield the results you want, you can do color balancing and editing. There are some filters in editing that might help with that, but truthfully, the best remedy is to use the proper microphone for the situation that you're in. So if any camera that has a built-in microphone is usually not suited well for doing interview situations, because a lot of them, they will pick up all audio equally. What's in front of it, what's behind it, everything around it. It's just going to pick up everything equally. So what you're looking at is trying to decide on the appropriate external microphone to use when you're doing interviews. When it's just B-roll and you're going to cut the audio anyway, it doesn't matter what you're using, because you're going to cut the audio in editing and drop in just the video over a conversation that was probably more properly mic'd, maybe in the studio or also out in the field. But when you're trying to do, when the audio matters, you want to do some sort of an external microphone. Now, ideally, in the situation that you were in, a handheld mic, all right, would probably have been your best bet, because it's built to do exactly what you want it to do. Pick up what's directly in front of it and suppress all of the background noise. Not that you don't hear it, but it's where you want it, in the background, okay? A lapel mic can also do the same thing. But out in the field, oftentimes, especially if you have multiple people that you're trying to interview, a handheld mic makes more sense, because if you have the interviewer asking the question, you can either give if your camera setup will allow it, you can have a second handheld mic for the person being interviewed, or maybe your interviewer prefers to ask the question, answer, and then maybe that person walks off and another person is queued up to eventually walk on next to the person being interviewed. And the handheld mic logistically just makes more sense, but a lapel mic will work. When you're using a lapel mic, you want to make sure that your guests, that basically from the neck down is unencumbered by things that will interfere with a lapel mic, like gigantic jewelry. I can get away with it today because I'm not wearing a mic. Sam is using a shotgun mic to pick me up. And he can do that because we're not in a room with particularly high ceilings, and he's pretty close by to me. If he were 20 feet away, this audio would come out very differently. Shotgun mics are great for distance, and in a pinch, they're better than using the built-in mic on a camera for picking up audio like this. But if this were a much bigger room, and there was a lot more going on, then we'd like to try to do a different choice. A handheld or a lapel mic would be better if it made sense in the situation. And again, some of it, there's a science to it, but then there's an art to it, and the art really comes into when you're dealing with logistics and a whole lot of other things. Okay? But yeah, so your best bet would be to start trying to get some external mics that you can use. Depending on the type of mic that you're using, you can possibly, with a handheld microphone, if you're sitting at a table like this, okay, and let's say your camera could only take 2 microphones, all right? Microphones are built with being, some are very directional, like a shotgun mic. It's only really going to pick up what's directly in front of it, not too much off from the sides. And lapels and even handhelds can be built that way too, to be more directional. But oftentimes, a lot of the handheld mics that we have, we buy them specifically to be omnidirectional. It will take things from all sides. Not at a great distance, but from all sides. So if you were able to set up 2 microphones with your camera, all right? The camera that Sam is using today can take 2 microphones, one of 2 different types, 2 of the same, it doesn't matter. It can take 2 different microphones. If both those microphones are omnidirectional handheld mics, you can do 1 mic per 2 people. So you could do a 4-panel discussion. If you got them around a corner, you might even be able to get 3 people to 1 handheld mic if you position things properly, so that way you can still see everybody's face when they're talking and they're not completely crammed in together. It can work. So yeah, you can make that work, and in a pinch, even a lapel mic will pick up from a little bit of a distance. If you can bring up the audio a little bit, you can tape it. We've had people that have taped lapel mics to a stage in order to pick up some audio better. And sometimes it does a better job doing it that way than using a shotgun mic, depending on how far away you end up being from somewhere. That's where in a situation like that, you could always, give the interviewers another microphone if you had the ability to attach a second mic, and you could, so that way the interviewers, even though they're behind the camera, you can at least hear their questions. Or that's where in editing, what you do is you end up cutting out the interviewers completely, and you can do you can create a graphic that introduces the question, and then you fade right into the responses of your guests, and then fade out, and then more questions. So there's a lot of different ways to handle those situations, so that way the final product is nice and smooth and gets all your information on. There are a few times where we have run out into the studio and just said cut, because we know we're going to start from the very beginning, okay? And it might be that, but oftentimes when you're doing that, it's better if there's going to be a segment, it's only like 10 minutes long, let them complete the segment and make a mental note and say, you know what, that was really good, except I noticed this. Is this a problem? Should we do this again, or can we let it ride? And that's always better than interrupting, because it still could be a perfectly good segment. And what seems like really bad in the moment, when you have a chance to regroup with the group and discuss it, it's not such a big deal, and you can let it go. And because again, with every time you cut to perfect something, you might be creating more work for yourself in editing, where maybe it's not really that big of a deal, or making it worse. If you're gonna do any editing, it just means that you're gonna you might cut a little closer to where it says now let's go inside, and maybe when there was some lag time, you're gonna take that off and do exactly as he said and go to when you're inside. That's the beauty of editing, is that any of those what feels like an awkward moment during filming, just delete it. Put something else in. It's all good. That's the difference between saying, okay, we're going to do this interview and you're going to let it kind of fall out however it falls out. And then there might be elements that you might want to stage a little bit more and plan, because you're going to do some editing, so you can bring things together. Because whenever you're doing something that's more scripted, as opposed to what we like to call a shoot and show, which is you hit record, the moderator opens the show, goes through the show, ends the show, we stop recording, it's done. There's no editing. Whatever happens. And a lot of people do, and it's very effective, because again, not everybody has the time or the inclination to do the editing. It's not for everybody, and it's not always, most of the time with planning, it's not always needed to still make an excellent informative show. But where you want to get a little fancier and do things a little bit more scripted, that's where when you're doing things scripted like that, every scene you're going to have usually at least 10 seconds on the beginning and 10 seconds on the end that are going to always get cut, and you absolutely have to have it. That count in of I've hit record, and then your camera person counts you in, and they point to you, because if you're trying to time hitting record to when that person says their first word, you will almost always cut off the. It's always kind of funny, because we'll have people that come in and they'll ask, well, how long should the show be? And we always tell them, well, look, if you could say what you need to say in 15 minutes or less, then so be it. Don't feel that you need to draw it out just to make a half hour or an hour long slot. But if you have that much great information that's coming out of the conversation, and it doesn't feel like it's just being drawn out, then let it go and continue, because maybe you can't get all that in 15 or 20 minutes. you know, and
learn,
some
you know.
people laugh because they're like, oh man, you kidding me? I won't talk for more than 5 minutes. And half hour later, it's, you know, it's a lot, they really kind of get into it. They get comfortable, they forget that the cameras are there, and they just have a conversation with the person that's interviewing them. When you're talking about just managing, you know, when you're talking about managing resources in terms of people's availability, equipment availability, and just the calendar, you know, we will sometimes have people that they can't get in often, but what they decide to do is, you know, typically we'll book a studio for 2 hours for a show, because that has to cover setting up, getting everybody mic'd, getting people seated, doing up to an hour show if that's what's going to happen. We don't always know, you know, they think it's an hour, it turns out to be 20 minutes. Sometimes they think it's 20 minutes, it ends up being an hour, and then break down the studio. So that's, you know, there's an overhead to every studio shoot in terms of setup and breakdown, and then there's what happens in between, which is the show. But people that might have a couple different guests or want to do multiple segments on the same topic that's going to be a series, they might book the studio for 3 or 4 hours, because they're going to set it up once and then they're scheduling their guests to come in. You know, we have nonprofits that feature some of their recipients of some of the grants that come in, and they do just that. They book for a couple hours and then they schedule. They're only doing 15-minute segments at a time, but they're getting 3, sometimes 3, 4 done in an evening, because it's hard to get all those people together at once. So you want to make the most of your time, even if not everything doesn't get aired at once. You want to make the most of your time.